Okay, gewalt. So the last thing that we learned yesterday was this interesting akula on challah of chutzlaretz, which is our challah. We're mafresh challah, and we learned akula from Shmuel right before the Mishnah, 4 lines before the Mishnah, that challas chutzlaretz. What happens if you have a bread? Your wife baked challah, and she forgot to be mafresh challah, and now you're on Shabbos. So what you can do is oichel v'hoilach. You can eat from the challah even before you mafresh it, but make sure to leave over enough that you can be mafresh challah later. The achakach mafresh, and you can be mafresh later. It's not like real tavel, where you first have to be mafresh, and then you can eat the rest of it, which is the way it is in Eretz Yisrael. But chutz la'aretz, where there's no chiyuv challah midaraisa, you can be mafresh the challah after you finish eating. And there's a shaila. The halacha is whenever you're mafresh shuma, it has to be min amukaf, meaning whatever you're being mafresh has to be part of what you're being masakin. So if I have produce in Toronto and I have produce in a warehouse in New Jersey, I can't, and they're both tevel, I can't use the produce in Toronto, make a truma, so that the produce in New Jersey will become masakin. You can't do that. It has to be together. So therefore, you can't just leave over what's going to be challah. You have to leave over a little bit more than what's going to be challah, so that when you actually separate the challah afterwards, there'll be something that's going to remain as not challah. That's what most of the place can hold. And this is very relevant, halacha l'maisa. Tosfos talks about an interesting question where Pesach by night, you realize that you never took challah from the matzah. So what are you supposed to do? So Tosfos has very interesting heter, which the poskim don't accept. So let's see.
Is this Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz? What are we talking? This matzah?
We're talking about Chutz La'aretz. We're talking about Chutz La'aretz. I'm sorry?
What's wrong with just leaving challah? You're about to take challah.
You don't mean mafresh the challah right now? Oh, because there's a problem. You're not really supposed to be mafresh challah on Yom Tov.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't. Oh, I'm sorry I didn't speak that out. That's the subject of what the Gemara was saying. You know, I'll be mafresh challah. No, it's like being mafresh trumas and maisos. So let's look at the bottom of the Tosfos. V'hecha the afa areva malaya isa. If you baked a full bowl of dough, me'erev Yom Tov, v'shakach v'lahipresh challah me'erev Yom Tov, and you forgot, and you weren't mafresh challah erev Yom Tov. So what should you do? Yishayir pas achas b'shvil kulam ad l'machar. Make sure not to use up all the different loaves of bread that you baked from this big dough. Save it until tomorrow, and then you'll be able to be mafresh challah after Yom Tov from that pas. Why are you allowed to do that? Because even though you have different loaves, but they all came from the same dough. So one loaf can patter up the others because it was all from the same dough. Aval, which is very fascinating, because what Tosfos is saying is that when I'm mafresh the challah, there is no rest of the thing that I'm being matter. I've already eaten it on Yom Tov. I'm just saving that loaf for tomorrow. What happens with Erev Pesach matzos? Im shochach v'lo hiprish, and you weren't mafresh challah. There, tzarich l'shayir mikol achas v'achas. There, each individual matzah you have to leave over from it. Why? Apparently, they didn't make one dough and then break it up into pieces and give to each person to make a matzah like we do. They must have given each person their own little dough, their own little flour and water, and every person made their own little dough. That's what we're saying. And tomorrow, take all the leftover pieces in one basket, and you'll, even from there, you'll only take one to represent the rest. If you want to do something even easier, what you should do is yasa matzah achas, make one big matzah, and bake them. It seems like you should take all those extra pieces and bake them to another matzah. I'm not sure exactly how you do that. Yitzarfe, and then you can have them all together. So what he's saying here is make a brand new. Oh, what he's saying is take a brand new matzah. Take a brand new matzah now, and make that brand new matzah to be matter, to be the challah that's going to be matter, the matzah that you ate already. So the person don't like this because you need to have min hamukaf here. You're taking a completely new separate matzah when all of the matzah that needed to be treated, so to speak, was already consumed. That cannot possibly work. So what the poskim say, if you're there Pesach night and your matzahs, and you schap that your matzahs, they were mafresh challah, at $27 or $32 a pound, they forgot to be mafresh challah. If you find that out, so after you store them and the steam dissipates from your ears and from your nose, after all that, what you should do is you should get a mufla samach la'ish to be mafresh challah. So a mufla samach la'ish is a cotton, but he's already matured enough that his nedarim are acceptable because he understands what's going on. So he is old enough to be mafresh challah, but he's not a gadol midaraisa. So therefore, he's not being over any yisurim by being mafresh challah. So that's what you should do. Okay. In the oldness, it was much more relevant when people bake their own matzahs. Nowadays, everything is bought commercially. Okay, I need to watch the clock. 5:04. We have about 3 minutes left, so we got to finish the coffee. Is someone watching the clock? We have 3 minutes. We have 5:39 is the best. Okay. Beit Shammai says, "In moilichen es asula mishoivech l'shoivech." So in those days, they used to have chicken coops, and if you wanted to go get chickens, you had to climb up and take your chicken out of the coop.
Those are dove cuts.
What they call dove cuts? Okay. So
Yeah.
it's not chickens. I refer to all birds as chickens, but really they're not all chickens. Okay, so let's see Rashi. At this point, the assumption is that there's special ladders. You can have a roofing ladder, which we're going to learn about, and then you can have a ladder that's made to climb into chicken coops. So right now we're assuming that we're speaking about the special ladder that was used at chicken coop. And therefore, it's obvious that this ladder is not a ladder that you're normally going to use to pave your roof. It's a ladder that's used just to get chickens and get doves from a dove. Okay, with time of the Beis Shammai says that you're not allowed to move this ladder around. The Gemara will explain the Asri why they ask. Here, all he's trying to do is get his meal. He's trying to get little doves for Yom Tov. Nevertheless, Beis Shammai says you're not allowed to move it around from one chicken coop to another chicken coop. That's right. Aval Mateu mechaloin. Mateu seems to mean that you keep its legs in the same place, but you just lean it over. So I'm almost envisioning it like you have like a loop, a circle of shoivichs, and you have your ladder planted on the ground in the center, and by keeping the legs of the ladder in the same place, you could sort of lean the ladder on to different parts of the shoivich that you're allowed to do. Zok Rashi ba'oisa shoivich atmai, in the same shoivich, so I guess the shoivich has sections to it. Shekein derech shoivich liyos b'mechitzos harbe. Inside the shoivich, there's going to be a whole bunch of partitions. Not all of the birds are kept together in the bullpen. There was a separate compartment for each pair of birds, and each section had a window, so you could access it to get the birds out of that window. But Basil holds there's not a concern to be allowed to. So if you noticed, the earlier Mishnais we had in this parak discussed Basil being machmer. Here, Basil went back to his native territory, and he's now being makel again, which is something that the Gemara is going to comment on. Okay, let me see if there's a Tosfos over here, because Tosfos asked an interesting question. Yes. Even if the birds were prepared, everything's prepared. Is there not a problem of tzeda, of capturing, which you're not allowed to do? Atzad yoyne shoyveich yoyne aliyah chayiv. Yeshloimer the maya bektanim shloi porchu. Once they're so small and they can't really escape, they're already considered contained, and that's not called captured. The place where it's usher is if you're really capturing it, because even though they're in a pen, they're still very mobile, and you still have to work pretty hard to pin them down.
These really aren't in a pen. The dovecot is they create these little holes or nests, and birds come and go. They're not captured at all. They feed themselves, they fly wherever they want, but this is where they live. And you just created those homes for them. So
The Tosfos is referring to birds that can't fly. So maybe if birds laid eggs there and there's some little chicklets that can't fly,
right, that's what they
we're
must
talking about
mean.
there.
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Shkoyach. So Amar Rav Chanan bar Ami. Rav Chanan bar Ami wants to clarify our Mishnah. Machloikis Rishus Rabbi. The whole machloikis as to whether or not, because you're not doing anything wrong over here. You're going to get birds or something. There's no issue at all here. So the only machloikis is in Rishus Rabbi. The Bishami Savri Haraya Omer Latiach Gaga Yitzara. Bishami is concerned if you're carrying a ladder around and moving it, well, maybe you're taking it to your roof because you want to smear more water proofing on your roof. And that's memareach. So that's an isser. So the problem is if I see someone carrying a ladder, I'm going to assume he's going to do a malacha daraisa, and because of Marisayin, we don't let you use a ladder even to get birds from a shayk.
What about binyan? What do you have to lift from the
I'm happy that you asked that question, because on Yom Tov there are those who hold that binyan would not be also. Why is that? Because binyan is needed to do things to tzorich oichal nefesh. Because when you press cheese into a form, that's called binyan also, and that's mutal tzorich oichal nefesh. And there's a rule by Yom Tov is mitoich shehut shel tzorich, hutter naman shaloi tzorich. Once binyan is a malacha that can be used for a davar shel oichal nefesh, it's not usher on Yom Tov at all, according to Shittas. So therefore, we have to find a malacha like mareach, which is something that is not used for oichal nefesh, and that's smearing more waterproofing on the roof. I think the way they built their roofs in those days, they had flat roofs, but a flat roof is going to allow water to gather. So what they would do is, even though the wooden structure of the roof was flat, when they put the tar on the roof, they built up the tar on one end more than on the other end. So it created an incline so that the water should run off. But over time, I guess that wore out, so they had to build it up again. So Zok to Gemara, the fact that you're taking it to a shoivach, that will be pretty obvious that you weren't repairing your roof. But in Rishus HaYachid, where no one sees, it's just for yourself. Divrei HaKoil Mutter, there everybody holds it's going to be mutter. Is that so? And this is a very famous Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Whenever the Chachamim outlaw something because of Marisayin, they don't start making differences. It's always across the board. And therefore, afilu b'chadrei chadarim also. Anything that's also because of Marisayin. And in this case, you're suggesting that moving a ladder around is also because of Marisayin, it's going to be also even even in a private place. So how could you, Rav Chanan, say that they agree that b'chadrei chadarim in Rishus HaYachid, you're allowed to move the ladder around? It's not consistent with what Rav said. And Rav, Rashi speaks out, was a Tanu Polik. He was a very serious person. So therefore, the Gemara feels that it's appropriate to ask from him. If we look at Rashi here, Rashi actually uses a very nice lashon on Rav. We are going to ask a kasha on Rav Chanan from Rav. Rav was the greatest gadladar in his times, except for Shmuel. So Shmuel was also a great person, just like Rav. But he was such a great person that you would ask the kasha on him, even on an Amora who can technically argue on. So Zok to Gemara Tanoi, in fact, this shaila where Rav expresses that B'chadri Chadarim, it will be also, not everybody agrees to that, there are some big titans that argue on him as well. The Tanya we learned, Shoitchan b'chama avaloi keneged ha'am. What happens if you're Rabbi Brunner and you go into the mikveh and a meshugana pushes you into the mikveh with your clothing on, and then you come up to daven and you're soaked from head to toe, right? This is not just a theoretical situation. This actually happened once. He came up soaked from head to toe. So he needs to dry his clothing, and you're not allowed to dry your clothing on Shabbos. So his hat also was like he poured water out of his hat, right? So the halach is shoitchan b'chama, misha nashru kelev b'derech b'meik shalom. A guy got soaking wet, and if you want to translate it literally, it means someone who got pushed into the mikveh by a meshugana. The halacha is shoitchan b'chama. You could lay him out in the sun, and then they will dry. They will get dried off by themselves. Aval Dr. Gemara loy keneged ha'am, and Rashi says you can't put him out on the line in your front yard where everyone walking by will see. Shelo yoyru kipsam b'Shabbos, because then people are going to think that you did laundry on Shabbos, which you're not allowed to do. Alma, what you do see from here is mididin shumaris ha'ayin muter b'makom t'nua. You see that in your backyard, which a makom t'nua, you are allowed to hang your clothing. That's the shita of Rabbi Elazar, and that's the shita of the Tanakama, who we are suggesting argue on Rav. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, and Oishrin, they will be consistent with Rav. So therefore, Rav Chanan is explaining our Mishnah, not consistent with Rav, rather consistent with the Tanakama, that Beishamai and Beisil both agree that for Shus HaYochid, in private, you're allowed to move your ladder around, it's only in public. That there's a problem, and the question is if there's a problem of Marisai. But there was another version as to how this went down. Rab Chanan bar Abi, Machloikis bar Ami, Machloikis b'Shus HaYochid. The whole Machloikis is b'Shus HaYochid. The Beishamai Islahu to Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Beishamai is the one who holds like Rav, and Beishamai holds that you have to be choishish for Marisai even b'Chadrei Chadarim. U'Beisil Leslahu to Rav, and Beisil holds you don't have to hold like Rav, and therefore even though it's also b'Shus HaRabim, but b'Shus HaYochid it's going to be more. U'Beisil Leslahu to Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Abu b'Shus HaRabim, but if this occurred in b'Shus HaRabim, then Divrei HaKol also, then everybody would agree it will be us. Correct the Gemara, according to this version, Rav is saying his halacha only according to Beis Shammai, and he won't be consistent with Beisil. So Lema Rav, the Amar Beis Shammai, Rav Chanan, do you want to understand that Rav Shita is going according to Beis Shammai, which is unlikely because we don't pass like Beis Shammai. And for the Gemara Tanoi, he said it's a machlokes Tanoim, meaning the Tanya Shoitchen B'chama Avaloi Keneged Ha'am. Rav Chanan will say that I don't hold like Rav, and I could learn pshat that in fact Beisil holds that it's going to be mutter because Beisil holds we're not geyser in a secluded place. But the Rav himself, and of course Dr. Chanan, will argue with me because Rav does want to be consistent with Beisil, and therefore Rav will learn that Beisil is even matter Barabim, and even B'Shus HaRabim, you'd be allowed to move a ladder around according to Beisil, and therefore there is no gzeir of Marisayin at all. Now, just about the sugi of Marisayin, there's a shaila if you say Marisayin only by a deraisa, or do you even say Marisayin if it's a shaila of a derabbanan? A lot of people are not makbid on Marisayin by the derabbanan. So where is this relevant in our lives? Is everybody remembers that when coffee whitener first came out, when they would serve coffee whitener by a wedding with coffee, there would always be a little sign placed that this is part of a coffee whitener. Right? This is a non-dairy creamer. Nowadays that it's proliferated, I don't think they have to put that sign anymore because everyone knows that it's pirate. But at the beginning, when it was still a novelty, they would put that sign. Why? Because that would be a problem of Marisayin. If you're serving milk after a fleshig meal, it would be Marisayin. People would think that you're eating not kosher. So there's actually a shaila if you have to put up such a sign when you're serving chicken, because chicken is only midrabanan. So there was such a shaila as to whether or not.
Even meat, even having coffee after meat is only durabanan. No,
that's true, but the problem would be if you're serving it on a table where meat was, it might end up. Yeah. So they had to, or no, they even put that notice up if they only serve chicken at a wedding. because they were probably makbid to put up the notification, even though it was chicken. However, in those days, now again it's not relevant. We know about non-dairy creamer, but in those days when they used to have those signs by wedding, what if you're having chicken for supper and after supper in your house you want to have a coffee? So you have to have one of those little signs. You have to. If you can have one of those signs, you can basically just swipe it from a wedding. Like you take the bencher, you'll swipe the sign too. Are you going to swipe those signs for the wedding so you could put it on your table? As you wrap yourself in your Hilton towel. So there's a shaila if you have to, but most people held that b'chadri chadorim, if it's only a shaila of a derbanan because it's chicken, you wouldn't need to make that sign. Okay, beautiful. Zok the Mishnah Vayta. Zok the Gemara Vayta. Masnisin the loiki aitam. The Mishnah that we just discussed, which shows that Beis Hillel is machmer, Beis Hillel is mekel, and Beis Shammai is machmer, will not be consistent with the following Tana. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Moedim Beis Shammai uBeis Hillel. Everybody agrees. Shemaylichin es hasulam mishoivech l'shoivech. Everybody agrees that you're for sure allowed to move the ladder from shoivech to shoivech. When I gave that introduction about who's machmer and who's mekel, that's referring to a later Gemara. I'm sorry, and I got mixed up. It has nothing to do with this Gemara. So let's take it to the top again. Our Mishnah that says that there's a machlokes if you can move a sulam around from one shoivech to another shoivech will not be consistent with the following Mishnah that says it a little bit different. Amar B'Shimon ben Elazar, Moedim Beis Shammai uBeis Hillel shemoilichin es hasulam mishoivech l'shoivech. So this is a lenient, a more kuladik version of what the machlokes is, where everyone seems to agree. If you're going from one chicken coop to another, it's not a chicken coop. You're going from one. I think it was called a dove coat. Going from one to another, that's for sure going to be allowed because clearly I'm only within an area where I'm only going to be doing things that I'm mutar and yomtiv. Lo nechleku. The discussion here between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is el lahachsir. Are you allowed to, after you're done, are you allowed to bring the ladder back? Beis Shammai says, ein machsirin. You're not allowed to bring the ladder back. That's already too much tircha. With Soloimim af machsirin, you could even bring the ladder back to where you wanted to keep it originally. And on that, Rabbi Yehuda added, Rabbi Yehuda, Amed Devar Mambulim. Where do we say that you're allowed to move the ladder around without a doubt? And the whole question is, if you're allowed to move the ladder back to its original location, that's Besulim Shel Shoivech. That's if you the type of a ladder that we're discussing is a ladder that was designed to be used in a shoivech. So the ladder Minei Ubei shows that it's a ladder that you're using for a malacha that's mutter, for an activity that's mutter and yom. Aval Besulim Shel Aliyah. But if you have a roofer's ladder, a ladder that's normally used to go up on a roof and repair it, they're divrei hakalos. That everybody agrees you would not be able to move around. So we've just learned a new distinction. It depends what type of ladder you have. A ladder that's a roofer's ladder, you're not allowed to use even for a mutter purpose, because that will for sure look like you're doing a malacha. Like Rashi says on the second line, Tahu vadai amri latiach kagei hutzarech. If you're walking around with a roofer's ladder, the assumption is going to be that you're going to do a malacha that's usher. If it's just from a coop, then there's not a problem. However, Abdoisa Omer, Mateyu mechaloin l'chaloin. You are allowed to lean it from one to the next. You can't move it around, but you could move it from chaloin to chaloin. You're actually allowed to move the bottom of the ladder a little bit at a time. You can't lift it up over your shoulder like a real guy who carries a ladder, but you're allowed to move it around a little. So it's a little bit unclear at this point exactly what Reb Doisa is talking about. So Rabbi Yehuda said, Asulam Shel Aliyah is problematic. And then on that, Reb Doisa is Mateo Mechalon Mechalon. So what is he saying? Is Reb Doisa coming to argue on Rabbi Yehuda and say that even if you have Asulam Shel Aliyah, you might not be able to carry it around, but you are allowed to move it from window to window? So Reb Doisa is coming to say a kula. He's arguing Rabbi Yehuda, you're machmer by Asulam Shel Aliyah. I'm saying even by Asulam Shel Aliyah, we can find a way for you to use it, and that's if you don't move the bottom of the ladder, you just move the top around. That's one option of how to learn. The other option as to how to learn is Reb Doisa is commenting on the Tanakama. And he said, even a regular ladder, a ladder that's made for a shoivach, not a roofer's ladder, I don't let you move it around. like you said earlier, the Bashamai and Basil both agree you're allowed to move it around. The question is, you're allowed to put it back. Maybe Rav Doisha arguing L'chomer says no. Even Bashamai and Basil, they only allow you to move the top of the ladder, but the bottom has to stay in its place. And now Rav Doisha is being very machmer. So it's a question that's not yet clear. Is Rav Doisha coming to be makel and he's even allowing a sulam shalaliyah, or is Rav Doisha coming to be machmer and he's adding restriction to a sulam of a shayk? And we'll see soon how this is interpreted. Zok to Gemara, b'nei Reb Chia, the children of Reb Chia, nafek l'kayos. They went out to the fields. I guess they owned fields, and they were going to do an inspection on their fields that they had employees working at. And being that they went out to the fields, they normally lived in the big city. They went out to the fields, which means that they spent a couple of days in the little villages that were near their fields. So normally when big Talmidei Chachamim show up in a village, they're going to be inundated with petitioners who are asking them questions. Shalas Valachi, you have a big guy in here, let's ask him shaylas. So Kiyasu, when they got back home, Amalu Avun, Reb Chia told them, did you have any interesting shaylas come up while you were there? I'd be curious to know what the shaylas were there from the villages. Amrullah, as a matter of fact, we did have an interesting shayla, Sulam Bali Ategu. And Rashi says, which that means is Haylecha Sulam Shalaliyah L'Shayvach. So they were asking a question about a roofer's ladder. There was a question that came to us, are we allowed to use a roofer's ladder? The Tarnuhu, and we allowed them to use the roofer's ladder. Amr Lahem, so Reb Chia said, oh boy, you made a big mistake. You better run back and correct your mistake. So Uva Asru Mashe Tartem, you better run back and tell them that your psak was wrong, and in fact, they're not allowed to use that ladder. Why were they allowing this ladder? Because they learned Reb Doisa like the first understanding, that he was coming to be Mekel over Rabbi Yehuda. Inu Sover, the children of Reb Chia thought, Midik Amar, Rabbi Yehuda, B'Shulam Shalaliyah, Loi Pligi, when Rabbi Yehuda said that everyone's machmer by Shulam Shalaliyah, and everybody agreed you can't move such a ladder around, Michlal, the Tanakama Savar, Pligi. Oh, sorry, again I messed this up. I mixed in Rabbi Doisa, which is also only relevant to the next shtickle of Gemara. So let me regroup. Rabbi Yehuda was the one who said that everybody holds a sulam shalaliyah is awesome, right? He said that very clearly. Mechlal, the Tanakama Savar, before Rabbi Yehuda was introduced and the machlokes of the Shammai and Basil was presented, maybe that's even speaking about a sulam shalaliyah. It's only Rabbi Yehuda who said that a sulam shalaliyah is more chomer than a sulam shal. Before we got up to Rabbi Yehuda, no one made any mention of the difference in what type of ladder it is. So you would assume, the Bnei Rabbi Chia assumed that this brayso of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar was talking about any type of ladder, and there's a machlokes by any type of ladder, and Beis Hillel is mekel by that type of ladder. And Beis Hillel allows you to take without qualifying what type of ladder it is. Any ladder you can move from shayvach to shayvach. So the Bnei Rabbi Chia understood that that's mutter according to Beis Hillel, and therefore they paskin for these villagers that even a ladder that was made to use as a roofer's ladder, even that ladder they could move according to Beis Hillel from shayvach to shayvach. But v'lohi, they didn't understand this brayso. And really, Rabbi Yehuda timing the Tanakama come apart. When Rabbi Yehuda qualified it and said, he wasn't arguing on the Tanakama, he was clarifying the Tanakama. So in fact, everybody agrees that a sulam shalaliyah is always going to be us. And therefore, Rabbi Chia told his children, you better go back and correct your mistake and tell the villagers that they may not, under any circumstances, move around a sulam shalaliyah, a roofer's ladder, on Yom Tov, even if they're using it for the birds. Mimai, how do I know with clarity that Rabbi Yehuda is not arguing? Rather, Rabbi Yehuda is clarifying what the Tanakhama said. What was the expression used by the Tanakhama? It said that you can take a ladder that's in the shayvach and move it to a different shayvach, which would clearly mean you're talking about a ladder from the shayvach. If we were talking about taking a ladder, a roofer's ladder, and using it for the shayvach, then they should have expressed it differently. If they're arguing about whether or not you're allowed to take a roofer's ladder and bring it over to your shayvach and use it there, what it should have said is you're allowed to move your ladder from your aliyah, your roofer's ladder, from its position into the shayvach. It doesn't say that. So this is what the Tana must mean. Shall shayvach in, shall aliyah loy. It must be that even the Tanakama is clearly saying that you're only allowed to move around a shayvach ladder, but you're not allowed to bring an external ladder, like a roofer's ladder, into your shayvach. And that's all Rabbi Yehuda was doing. He was clarifying what the Tanakama meant. And therefore, a sulam shalali is also regardless. So when you allow them to do it, thinking that Beis Hillel allows it, you made a mistake, go back and correct your mistake. But it's not like the Bnei Rabchia were fools. They might have misinterpreted the Mishnah and their father corrected them. But what were they thinking? Zok Gemara, what they were thinking is Mikatani Sulam Shal Shoivech. It doesn't say Sulam Shal Shoivech. It says Mi Shoivech Li Shoivech Katani. So maybe it means, maybe what they mean to say is you can take a ladder of an aliyah, you can move it to the first shoivach, and then you can even move it further from shoivach to shoivach. But it's not so clear from the Tanakama that they are outlining a ladder of an aliyah. Maybe in fact the ladder of the aliyah would be allowed. Nevertheless, Rabbi Chia told him to correct it, and that a ladder of an aliyah is not allowed according to anybody. Ikadamri, there was another version of what question was presented to them when they were there in the villages. And Ikadamri, Amruloi, Hitui, Sulam, Shalaliyah, Boyaliyah. The question was, the ladder was already in the shoivach. The question is, am I allowed to keep the bottom of the ladder in the same position, but lean the ladder into different areas so that the top of the ladder will allow access to different shoivach? And that's what they allowed. Yitarnuhu. And that's what we allowed them to do. Amr Lahem. So Rabbi Chia told his sons, you still made a mistake. So you better go and retract your heter and tell them that you're not allowed to even move your ladder to the top of the ladder around from area to area. Why is that? This is what I was referring to earlier. Inu Sover, they thought they understood that Reb Doisa was trying to be makel over what the Tanakama said. But it's not the case. Rather, my Dekashari Tanakama Ka'asar Reb Doisa. Reb Doisa is adding additional restrictions to the kula that the Tanakama said. So if we look at that back inside, what happened over here was and on that Reb Doisa says Matayu Mechaloi Mechaloi. So we had a question. Is Reb Doisa saying that even a sulam shalaliyah, you can't move it around, but you could be matit Mechaloi Mechaloi, which is what the children of Reb Chia thought, and that's why they allowed the townspeople to move the top of the ladder from chaloin to chaloin as long as they didn't move the bottom of the ladder. So Reb Chia corrected them and said, no, Reb Doisa is not going back on Reb Yehuda. Reb Doisa is going back on the Tanakama, where we're speaking even about a ladder of a shoivach, and even there I don't allow you to move it. I only allow you to tip the top of the ladder into a different direction. And therefore, you better go back and tell the townspeople that you're not allowed to move the ladder around the way you suggested. Okay, let's just see Rashi. Rashi says, the case was where the ladder was already in place before Yom Tov. They just wanted to tilt it so that the top of the ladder would reach a different chaloin in the shayvach. So they thought that Reb Doisa was being makel by the kasher Tanakama, the Reb Doisa, the Tanakama of Reb Doisa, who Reb Yehuda, who happens to be Reb Yehuda. The Amar b'sulam shalaliyah asur lahila. Reb Yehuda said that a sulam of an aliyah is not allowed to move it around, and at that kasher Reb Doisa milahatos. Reb Doisa said, even though you're not allowed to move around the sulam shalaliyah, but you are allowed to move the top to lean it in a different direction. But v'loi, my the kasher is Tanakama. Reb Doisa is being more machmer than everybody. And he looked at the kula of the Tanakama, the Hainu Shal Shoivach Lahila. The Tanakama allows you to move around a ladder that was designed to be used for the Shoivach. And there Reb Doisa puts additional restrictions. Ka'asir Reb Doisa. The Asr Lamemar, Haylacha Asr Hatayashar. Even though you're not allowed to move even a ladder of a Shoivach around, but you are allowed to tip the top of the ladder around. He's not even discussing Shalaliyah. That's completely outlawed. But even that of a Shoivach, you're not allowed to move. You're not allowed to move the bottom of the ladder around. Even though Bisham said that you're not allowed to move the ladder of a shayvach around, you're allowed to lean it from chaloin to chaloin. Alma, what do you see from here? From our Mishnah, it's a question of Simcha Shamtiv. If you want to get birds to be able to use for Simcha Shamtiv, Beis Hillel allowed you to do it, and Beis Shammai did not allow you to do it. So is that the perspective that Beis Shammai is machmer when it comes to Simcha Shamtiv, and Beis Hillel is mekel? Mini. We had an earlier Mishnah that actually showed the opposite, that Beis Hillel was machmer when it came to Simcha Shamtiv versus a Shaila Lalacha. We're meaning a Shoichet Chayev Oif B'Yamtiv, Beis Shammai Yomim Yachber B'Deker B'Yichasa, Beis Hillel Meloi Yishchot, Elam Kin Hayeloi Afar Muchin B'Boy Yoim. So there Beis Hillel was the machmer, and he said, don't have the Simcha Shamtiv. If there's going to be a chance that you're going to have to do Kisei Adam, and there's going to involve some Yisurim, don't do the Simcha Shamtiv. So here Beis Hillel gives precedence to the Simcha Shamtiv and allows you to move the ladder around. Yet in the first Mishnah, Beis Hillel says, let's push aside Simcha Shamtiv. We have to be careful about moving the earth around. So Amar Yochanan Mechlefes Hashita. So I believe Rashi learns that Mechlefes Hashita means our Mishnah here. Our Mishnah here, where Beis Hillel is mekel and allows you to move it around, change that and say over here that Beis Hillel is machmer. Say over here that Beis Hillel is machmer. Tosfos argues and says, no, let's change around the first Mishnah and let's make Beis Hillel be mekel in the first Mishnah. And then there are certain shittas who hold Mechlefes Hashita means we don't even know who owns what. We don't know who owns what.
So why do we have to come on to being? Why do you have to come on to being mechlefes? I mean, there's two different reasons. It's not because of Simchas Yantav. I mean, the Kisei Adam is a different reason than
that's exactly what the Gemara's kasha is going to be. It's exactly what the Gemara's kasha is going to be. There's differences in the actual case why one should be mutter and why one should be also. It's exactly what the Gemara's kasha is going to be. Beautiful. Now there's an interesting thing to point out. If it's mechlefes hashita,
It looks like they're copying on Simchas Yontif. The idea is not Simchas Yontif. The idea is what Dovi is saying.
that's exactly what the Gemara is going to say in a minute. It's not just a question of Simchas Yontif versus a Shaila. Each Shaila is independent, and you could look at it differently. What they ask is, if it's mechlefes hashita, so why didn't they fix the Mishnah? Why leave the Mishnah if you actually had to change it? So why Taka didn't they change it?
Because they don't know what
No, that's not a question. They always do that.
Yeah, what do you mean? Who's going to change it? You don't change a Mishnah. How can an Amira can't change a Mishnah?
The Surah Mechzer is something missing. Here it's actually quoting the Shita of Beis Shammai wrong and the Shita of Beis Hillel wrong.
You never had before where they said we're gonna switch it around, we're gonna make something.
Yeah, it's fair there as well. I'm not asking what only without Vidveya. So there are those who learn that once Rebbe made the Mishnayos and people memorized them so that they'll remember Torah, we didn't want to start messing with it because it would confuse people. So we left it in the old version, even though technically it shouldn't have been that way. So even the Mishnayos weren't perfect, right? But they had to leave good enough alone because it was easy for people to remember.
Unless you could just say the Mechlefes Hashita like the third Shita that we don't know how to fix it.
Right. According to that shot, we don't know who holds what. There's got to be some problem here. We don't know exactly what it is. Okay. So now the Gemara asks Dovi's kasha and Chaim Tzvi's kasha. Why is it the same machlokes? What makes you say that the both machlokes are exactly the same? Simcha Shamtiv versus some type of iser. Mimai. Dilma Atkan like Rami Beis Shammai Hasam. Maybe the only reason why Beis Shammai was makel in the first Mishnah is Elahecha Dikin Dakar notes. We said there's already a shovel in the ground, and Rashi says, and Rashi's Rashi and later, and therefore you're not digging. So we went through the mechanics and there's no issue there. Elahecha Deleka Dekar notes loy. But if there is no Dekar notes, then maybe in our case Beis Shammai would be machmer. And Rashi explains, Elahecha Deleka Dekar notes. Now Dekar notes is not relevant when it comes to a shayva, but you don't have the equivalent of a Dekar notes. The Iketzad Remes Chafira, there is some concern over here, a real concern. By there, maybe Beis Shammai didn't see any real concern because it was already pre-dug. Here, there is a valid concern. The Iketzad Remes Chafira Lo Sharu Vafilu Ba'afet Tikhuach Shehuka Chechafer Vaymet Vachanami Lo Shna the Ike Cheshada Latich Kagay. There, if everything wasn't prepared and all of the possible problems weren't mitigated, maybe Beis Shammai wouldn't allow it. Here, we haven't mitigated all of the concerns because here there is that chashash that someone's going to think that he's fixing his roof. So, like Dovi and Chaim said, it has nothing to do with the same question of Simchas Yom Tov trumping these problems. That problem Beis Shammai assessed was not a concern, and this problem is a concern. So Inami, or you can say the other thing. Why did Beis Hillel say over here it's allowed? Because there's a shayvich there. It's obvious if I'm working on the shayvich, I'm not fixing my roof. But by the case of Kisui Adam, there's problems there. So therefore, don't tell me that this is the same thing that requires Mechlef Hashita. If you actually want to find a problem, I'll show you a problem. I'll show you a problem that will force us to switch things around. Because we have as follows. It says, the Shammai Oimrim, lo yitoil elam kain nana meb'oidyon. The Shammai says you're not allowed to take a bird out of a chicken coop unless you actually went before Yom Tov and grabbed the bird itself to designate that this is the bird that I'm planning to use on Yom Tov. And Rashi says, lo yitoil min agajalos b'Yom Tov. You're not allowed to take a bird to eat on Yom Tov. Elam kain nana meb'oidyon. You can't just announce and declare, I plan to take that bird to use. Rather, you have to physically grab it. Why is that? The Gemara is going to explain later on. Maybe when you're actually grabbing the bird, you see this little cute little chick, and you won't have the heart to shecht it. But if you grabbed it already, then we know that you're determined. He doesn't have to grab anything physically. He can just declare verbally, I'm planning to use this bird. Alma, so there you see, there you see Beis Shammai was machmer by Simchas Yom Tov, because you have to grab it itself before, otherwise you won't be able to use it. And Beis Hillel says, no, it's enough to declare it. We're a mini, but we have a stira, because it says, going back to our original Mishnah, where there, Beis Shammai is Mekel versus here where he's Machmer. So once again, you have a stira. So on that, Rabbi Yochanan said Mechlefes Hashita, because there's a difference between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as to if they allow Simchas Yom Tov to trump the concern. Frankly, more the same question again. There are specific details in each of these cases that would lead to paskening differently. Where did Beis Shammai say that it's mutter in the case of Kisui Adam? Once again, all of the concerns have already been mitigated. But if not all the concerns have been mitigated, then maybe Beis Shammai would not allow it. As Rashi explains, this case with the animals, with the birds, that he's mechayiv you to actually pick up the bird before Yom Tov, when we haven't mitigated all the concerns, because Dilma Mimlach, he might change his mind. And then he took it for no reason. He carried the bird around for no reason. But once he lifts it up before Yom Tov, then for sure he's going to follow through. If he changed his mind, then his Hazmana is bought. So there's a concern, and that's why the Shammai was machmer here. Inami, atkan lakamri b'sil hacha, elakivin muksahu, v'oimid v'oimer zev v'zeh ani naitel sagi. Since the whole problem that we're dealing with is not a real issue that it's muksa. So therefore, declaring that I intend to use this bird on Yom Tov, that's enough to take away the muksa. Aval hasam loy. But over there, in the case of the digging, there we have a real problem. And since we have a real problem over there, there Beis Hillel is mach. So once again, you can't leave this and assume it's just the overall shiloh. Each case has its individual reasons for the chumrah or the kula, depending on who you are. Okay, so I didn't prepare this, so we'll do this together. Ikasha, we have a couple of minutes though. Ikasha hakash. If you want to find a real problem where there's going to be contradiction in Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, this is more of a place. Beis Shammai a noitlin as a eli lekatzavel of basar. Eli is, Rashi says, is a daf of the kavod. It's a big piece of wood that you use to chop meat on. The koichim by chitim letargis v'tisni. They would chop up wheat kernels to make, I guess, porridge. That piece of wood is considered a klisha malach l'isher because it's used to do activities that are not allowed to be done on Shabbos. Because Beis Shammai holds also l'chalti. That wood is a muksa, even if it's a klisha malach l'isher, and you're not allowed to move it around. Even the tzarech chufay because you need it here for an activity that's mutter on Yom Tov. You want to use it to cut the meat up, which you are allowed to do. Nevertheless, Beishamai says this klisha malachta le'iser, you're not allowed to use it with tzarech kufa. Beis Hillel matir it, and there Beis Hillel was matir for you to move that wood around and use it to cut your meat on. Alma, you clearly see there Beishamai is machmer, and he doesn't allow you to use the piece of wood to cut your meat. Beis Hillel lekula uramini. Once again, going back to our first Mishnah, where Beis Shammai was mekel and allowed the kisei adam, allowed you to do the kisei adam, and Beis Hillel didn't. So once again, you have a problem. And once again, and once again, the Gemara says, no, maybe there's special reasons in each case for the psak. Once again, Beis Shammai was mekel in the first Mishnah because all of the concerns have been mitigated. But when we're talking about this wood, we haven't taken care of the muksa. He will not allow to use it. Inami, or on Beis Hillel, you could say, why does Beis Hillel allow you to use this piece of wood to chop meat on? Is Ella the Ika Toris Klialov, because this wood has a Toris Kli. What does that mean, Rashi? Toris Klialov, even though it's a Klisha Malach Isser, because normally it's used to chop wheat, which wouldn't be allowed to be done, but mutter lataltaloi l'tzarech chufay. Since you need it itself for a mutter purpose, you're allowed to do it. Well, hasam loy, but over there you don't have this. Over there, there's a real concern that there might be an issue. So once again, you cannot equate the two cases. If you want to find a contradiction where you're forced to say mechlefes hashita, you're going to have to find another contradiction. And now we have another case. Beis Shammai says, "Ein noisten esaor lefnei hadarsen." You're not allowed to put, or Rashi says, so you have hide, shehuf should be Yom Tov. You skin an animal on Yom Tov, and you're not allowed to put oil lefnei hadarsen, meaning lo yishtechenu b'makam drisas haragolim. You're not allowed to put it in a place where people will walk on it, because that was part of the process that they did to process the leather, is they stomped on it. By people trampling on it, it's going to move in the direction of its processing to make it leather. So you're not allowed to throw it on the floor where people are going to inadvertently walk over it. You're not even allowed to lift it. It's muksa, unless there's a kazayis basar on it, which means there's something that you can benefit from on Yom Tov, you would not be allowed to move around these iris at all. They're muksa. Beis Hillel matir, but Beis Hillel does allow it. Why does he allow it? Rashi, because the Gemara's argument here is that it's all about simcha shamta. Because if you're not going to let him process the hide, then he won't check it at all, because I guess he's afraid the hide will get ruined. So once again, let's say that this is all about simcha shamta. We're mini, once again, from the very first mission in our parak. And on that, and once again, the Gemara says, no, there's a special situation over there. Once again, we've mitigated the concerns in our Mishnah about kisei adam. This piece of hide is a problem to do. You wouldn't be allowed to process it. Beis Hillel by the hide only allows it. You can use it on Yom Tov as well. It has a use on Yom Tov. Rashi says, how would they sit down? They would spread a beggar on the ground, and then they would sit on their knees. We would lean on each other's hips and each other's loins. So even spreading it out, even though as a side it gets processed, but the spreading itself will impact Yom Tov as well. But by kisei adam loy. So I guess we'll stop here. And at the end of the day, we're trying to find challenges from all over against the first Mishnah that showed that Beis Shammai is mekel, or gave precedent to simcha shamtiv over a potential concern, and the Gemara is asking from all over to show otherwise, and the Gemara is always diffusing it. So we'll stop here. We'll be mamshech tomorrow. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a very easy fast and a wonderful day. We can use a Sunday today. But
Right.
today's not Sunday.
One doesn't like when they spill all